Sega's rise, and the moment everything started to crack. Those who are interested in the history of gaming have been debating a single subject for many years. Would Sega have been able to survive the console war if it had released the appropriate system in the proper time? The failure of Sega's hardware business was not the result of a single error, but rather a series of mistakes that occurred in succession. These errors included the hurried release of the Sega CD, the poor support for the 32X, the high cost of the Saturn, and an identity crisis that left both gamers and developers perplexed. Nevertheless, a console concept developed within Sega's own technical labs was, according to a number of historians, potentially poised to alter the history of gaming. It is a system that is strong enough to directly compete with Sony, simple enough for developers to enjoy, and delivered early enough to beat the PlayStation to market. This lost system is often referred to as Sega's true 32-bit successor to the Genesis, essentially, the console that could have saved the company. A company divided, Japan versus America. In the early 1990s, Sega discovered that it was in an exceptional position. The Genesis was a huge success in North America, surpassing Nintendo in sales in a way no one could have imagined. In the past, Sega established a brand centered on speed, attitude, and innovative arcade experiences. From the inside, however, the corporation was divided into two distinct entities, Sega of Japan and Sega of America. Each division intended to capitalize on the success of Genesis, but they had significant disagreements over how to do so. Sega of America wanted a clean, basic next-generation console, a real Genesis replacement with robust 3D capabilities and no add-ons. During this time, Sega of Japan was promoting a strategy based on rapid hardware availability and the implementation of experimental upgrades. Development resources were dispersed as a direct consequence of this. The Sega CD and the Sega 32X were introduced by Sega, rather than concentrating on a single, powerful next-generation platform. These devices caused division among the player base, led to a loss of financial resources, and left developers bewildered, as they were no longer sure where to direct their efforts. The lost console, Sega's SGI partnership that never happened. The fact that Sega of America has already begun creating an actual next-generation console in cooperation with Silicon Graphics, SGI, a firm that is well known for its high-performance 3D graphics hardware and Hollywood visual effects, is something that a lot of fans are unaware of. SGI was the first company to approach Sega with a proposal for a cost-effective 3D chipset that would have been the core of Sega's next platform. Nintendo was not the first company to receive this proposal. If this system had been given the go-ahead, it would have been released in 1994 or early 1995, providing developers with a unified, powerful platform capable of current 3D capabilities. This would have been a significant advantage over the PlayStation. The prototype was reportedly capable, inexpensive, and significantly simpler to program for than the Saturn would eventually be, according to those with knowledge of the situation. But Sega Japan did not accept SGI's proposal, stating that it did not meet the technology's requirements. After that, SGI approached Nintendo, and the technology it had developed became the basis for the Nintendo 64. The Saturn, a console built on panic, not planning. Meanwhile, Sega Japan developed its own next-generation system, the Sega Saturn. This machine was designed to scale sprites and function well in 2 dimensions, rather than to have genuine 3-dimensional geometry. Sega went into a frenzy after Sony announced that the PlayStation would prioritize rendering with 3-dimensional polygons. In an effort to improve Saturn's 3D performance, engineers raced to install a second processor. However, this led to a design that was notoriously difficult to understand. Programmers now face the challenge of dealing with dual central processing units, CPUs, 4 coprocessors, and a system that required complex low-level coding to extract performance. The result was predictable. Developers favored PlayStation because its tools were simpler and its hardware was more streamlined. If Sega had instead produced the more straightforward SGI-powered console, third-party developers would likely have flocked to it. The lost system would have been easier to sell, less expensive to build than the Saturn, and significantly more competitive with Sony's ambitions to focus on 3D. the release disaster that sealed Sega's fate. An additional issue that was of utmost significance was the timing. As a result of the hasty launch of the Saturn, which took place early and did not include any prior warning indicators, both retailers and customers lost faith in the product. It came as a surprise to large chains, and players were not interested in purchasing a pricey console that only offered a restricted selection of games. On the other hand, the SGI-based system was developed with the intention of ensuring a far more seamless deployment,
and it was supported by the marketing team at Sega of America that had the most experience.
It would have been conceivable for Sega to become the industry leader in the 3D era if the company had published the game in 1994 and paired it with its other great arcade titles, such as Daytona USA, Virtua Fighter, and Virtua Racing. This would have allowed Sega to achieve this goal. Saturn, on the other hand, was a latecomer to the actual 3D revolution, and it was both confused and expensive. There was also a late arrival at the celebration. A world with the saved Sega console. What might have happened? Particularly significant is the fact that the missing console would have brought Sega's fragmented identity together. With no Sega CD, no 32X, and no hurried Saturn, developers would have had to commit to one platform. Players wouldn't have been forced to navigate a tangle of incompatible add-ons. And Sega's finances, already stretched by the pricey hardware experiments of the early 90s, would have remained intact long enough for the Dreamcast, Sega's most beloved and ahead-of-its-time console, to arrive in a healthy market. There are numerous historians who believe that if Sega had introduced this single, focused, SGI-based 32-bit system, the business would have continued to be a dominant hardware maker well into the 2000s. The legacy of the console that never was. When everything is said and done, the narrative of the system that had the potential to save Sega is not about what was developed, but rather about what was not constructed. This narrative is about missed opportunities, internal strife, and a particular instance in which Sega found itself at a crossroads and chose the wrong direction. An example of a console that existed only in prototypes and paper blueprints, the SGI system is still considered to be one of the most significant what-ifs in the history of gaming. This console had the power to completely transform the industry's history. Sega could have become Sony's most formidable competitor if it hadn't been forced out of the hardware business. If this had happened, the current gaming scene would have been very different.
And that was the story of the console that could have changed everything for Sega. The one system that might have rewritten in gaming history if things had gone just a little differently. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what could have been, make sure to like the video, subscribe to Video Game Guy, and hit the bell so you never miss another breakdown of the hidden chapters of gaming's past. Thanks for watching.